Welcome to another edition of Beyond Sunday. Hi, I'm Peter Bay, Director of Next Gen here at King of Kings, and also Campus Director, going to be that very soon for our Northwest site here in Omaha. And I'm here with Dr. Tim Reilly, clinical psychologist, also part of King of Kings' Best and Worst Bluegrass group. We do not have an official name. But we do play every once in a while at Classic Grace at 8 a.m., so just be watching for us. Maybe you'll come in here. So maybe we'll play at a nursing home near you sometime in the future.
There we go.
There you go. So Dr. Tim Reilly, today in this episode, we're going to talk about this changing landscape of the LGBTQ plus community, and how this has been changing over time, and how we as parents, as grandparents, friends, church members, non-church members, like how this is changing and how we can think of it in helpful ways. And so we're going to just jump into this with this question. What is the current reality of what our kids are experiencing regarding LGBTQ?
Well, the biggest change over the last, at least in my experience, over the last 5, maybe 10 years, I don't know, is just how on the surface these issues are, whereas before there might have been, talk about, this kid or not, that student or not. Now it's a point of almost routine discussion. And in some ways it's gone from being something that was sort of a marginal topic of interest to now almost being cool in a way. So kids are very often affirmed or identified as courageous if they come out in one way or another. So much more accepting, I guess, but also more pressured in a different way than it has been historically.
So through this podcast, this is for anyone who wants to listen. We hope this will be helpful. But as parents, this landscape is really changing. Over the last even 10 to 20 years, this is changing. As parents, we need to be knowledgeable of it, and we need to know how to love regardless through it, because we may have kids in our own homes. Our kids will have friends who are part of this community. And so, Dr. Tim Reilly, how has this discussion changed over the last 10 to 20 years?
Well, mostly in terms of just the amount of discussion we're having about it. And it's not as if this is the only area that's changed. Over the past 10 or 20 years, we've gotten a lot more focused on identity based on groups versus identity based on individuals. And so part of what's really important to me is to recognize that every person we talk to, regardless of whether we're talking about gender or sexual identity issues or whatever, or anything else, that we're talking about individual human beings who are individual creations, no more or less worthy of respect and love than any other person is, than I am or you are. And that's always the premise of everything that we do. But in terms of how have our discussions changed, they've changed more in the direction of being guided by internal processes, by emotions, by thoughts, than by facts and ideas. So in my mind, this is just one of a broader number of things where we've moved in the direction of saying we want to try to change our external reality to match our internal state. So, for example, if you would have come to me 25 years ago and say, I have gender dysphoria, I believe I'm a woman trapped inside of a man's body, which would be really, really unfortunate for you, considering.
Well, I've got some curves. Come on now. Come on now.
I would have said, okay, well, what we're going to do is help you learn how to come to terms with your external reality, right? The biology is unchangeable. And so what we're going to do is try to help you adapt to your circumstances as well as you have and get along. And now that sort of flipped to the direction is we're going to try to adjust your external circumstances to fit your internal situation. And this is part of a very long sort of philosophical track that involves us focusing much more on our idiosyncratic internal lives as being the guide for what we do, rather than systems of morality or logic or reason or whatever. I hope that makes some sense. Yeah.
Yeah, you're using really big words that I'm nodding to. I'm going to have to look up a lot of these words later, but that's okay.
Okay.
So I do trust that the majority of our listeners are probably a little more linguistic than I am, but it seems as though in our current culture, it's either like you're totally against this or you're 100% affirming. You're either marching in the parade for or marching in a parade against. And I'm not sure that either of those really help contribute to a conversation or a discussion that allows us to really weave through like how to properly handle this, and also how to love each person around us well. So as a parent, knowing that there's this dichotomy of like against it or for it, and knowing that there really is a middle ground that's hard to talk about, when should I start talking about this with my kids? I mean, we were on a vacation. My kids were watching Arthur, and there was an episode of where Arthur's teacher is marrying a male teacher is marrying a man. And so this was a few years ago, and that was the first time that my kids were like, "What's going on with this?" Mm-hmm. So that began a conversation that I got to have with the kids, and I was actually kind of excited about it because I got to begin this conversation, but it was initiated by an Arthur episode. When should we as parents start to initiate these conversations with our kids?
Well, I think your own experience is a good guide. It's when they're asking questions or when you know someone else is talking to them about these issues. By and large, I mean, we tend to sort of project our own thoughts about things onto little kids. Most little kids are not thinking beyond, is it chicken nuggets or peanut butter and jelly for lunch today? I mean,
both good options.
Yeah, that's sort of the focus of their life. And so a big part of it is to be sure that we're not answering questions that they're not asking, that we don't bring our whole adult context onto all of these things. But also, once somebody else starts talking to them about it, they're beginning to form opinions and beginning to develop a framework of how they're going to think about it in the future, then we want to make sure that we're entering into that conversation. Regrettably, in my estimation at least, that time in schools is earlier and earlier. Mm-hmm. And so, in part, being aware of what's being talked about at school and how this is being presented at school is an important feature of being an alert parent. If there's a good side to the whole COVID academic, which we talked about in an earlier podcast, it's that a lot of us became more aware of things, not just in this area, but other things that were being talked about in school that we didn't necessarily agree with. And that's been a prompt for us to get more involved.
Yeah. So when I do talk to my kids about this, are there healthy and unhealthy ways to talk about it? And if so, like, what is the more healthier approach? One of our goals for this podcast, or I'll just say our goals, are really to help us as parents and people in our communities have positive tools with whatever topic we're talking about, and also for us to be encouraged that we're not hopeless in this situation.
Right.
So are there healthy or more unhealthy ways to talk about this with our kids? What does that look like?
Yeah, probably. I mean, the notion is to be, as I mentioned earlier, accepting of all people, right? So if they have friends who are talking about this, or friends who have come out as one orientation or another, to say that we still accept those people and we love those people as much as we do anyone, but also to recognize that acceptance is not the same as agreement. So, I can accept your musical tastes even though I don't agree with most of them.
Is that a true statement? Are you not a big fan of the boy bands?
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah.
How about Boys to Men, the original boy band?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
Okay, we'll talk
Yeah,
about that later.
yeah, okay. We can arm wrestle about that later on. But we don't have to agree with someone to accept them. And not accepting them doesn't mean we hate them or that we're phobic, that we're afraid of them or something like that. And then making sure that we understand that kids know that people have different life experiences and that their life experiences affect them differently. And you may be able to point to some individual in their experience who has some other kind of condition or that's different than theirs, and point out that that doesn't make them any less. It just makes them different, and we need to acknowledge that. But also, the most important thing that you said was that this sort of dichotomous, I'm for this, I'm against this, whatever. I don't think we have to be, as people of faith, against things. We know what we're for.
That's good.
And if we hope to lead somebody in a positive direction, we don't do that by telling them where not to go. That's a very long list. And takes up a lot of time. But what we want to do is say, well, this is the way I see things. This is the way we see things in our family. We might want to poke around in Genesis a little bit and talk about what God's plan is for family, but also that not everybody sees it that way. And we can still love those people without accepting, their particular lifestyle or their particular direction in things. I got a whole bunch of people that I disagree with a lot on a lot of things. So, not to trivialize that area, which is important and really difficult for a lot of people. But you could point out some people are Wisconsin fans, some people are Nebraska fans. Neither is better or worse than the other. You like this food, you like baseball, they like soccer, they whatever. And those are trivial examples, but it points to just the unique aspect of each individual. And so we don't have to agree with everybody on every particular thing.
Yeah, but when our disagreement screams louder than our love for that person, that's an issue.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's Jesus said these three remain: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. It wasn't the greatest of these is even truth. Truth matters, and we believe in an absolute truth. But
and I think that's an important point, that
right.
you not minimize the truth as we see it,
right?
Because if we believe what we believe, then if we act to the detriment of other people in terms of their own faith, then we contribute to that. So I want to focus on the idea of telling the truth as I believe the truth to be in the most loving way possible, but also not to abandon the truth for the sake of convenience of a discussion.
Right. I've heard it said that oftentimes the church is known more for what we're against than what we're for. I've heard people like to remind, like, Jesus, when he was on earth, who did he hang out with? The tax collectors and the sinners and the prostitutes, and then people interpret that almost as like then we should hang out with the sinners, and the reality is we are
hanging out with the sinners every Sunday.
We are it, and if we see ourselves as not as that category, we're wrong, and we're going to really struggle to forgive and have mercy and love the people around us.
Yeah. And part of the problem is that I think the church has been complicit, or at least bears some responsibility as an institution, in that we come out so strongly against these things if they don't comport with exactly the way we see things, not necessarily in a purely biblical sense, but just structurally church stuff. And then we make it difficult for people to function within that. We almost create an environment where something else is going to fill that space. So, for example, if the church is against having people have some kind of a contractual relationship that resembles marriage, and we're just dead against that, then eventually somebody co-opts the idea of marriage and says, well, now marriage includes all of these other things, which it was never intended to do. And so in our, at times in our own sort of closed-mindedness, we've fostered or at least facilitated the very circumstances that have made people move in these directions.
So a big change in the last 10 to 20 years has also been the rise of social media.
Yes.
And that's been a crazy change. When I started college in 2004, Facebook was just getting going. I remember getting an account on Facebook and not even like knowing what in the world do I use this for. And it was at that time, it might have been like college kids only had Facebook. And it's really evolved quite a bit in the last 18 years since then. And so how does social media affect the conversation with LGBTQ?
In a big way, is in my estimation. Social media, as you know, and I had a Facebook for about 15 minutes. What you see there is not an accurate representation of what people's daily lives are like. It's sort of the punctuating moments of the narrative of life, and you see what people want to put on there. And so what you end up doing for a lot of my patients and other people, I think in general, is creating circumstances where they feel inferior somehow, or that they're not measuring up, and they want to be more like whatever they're seeing on social media. So it's challenging in that direction, but maybe more importantly for someone who is an adolescent, which is for most people, maybe all people, a time of some confusion and some wondering about what's my role, how do I think about myself, where do I fit in, all of that. And we start looking for answers to those things, which is a perfectly reasonable and appropriate thing to do in adolescence. But if, for example, if things haven't gone well for you socially, or you're struggling in some other way, you start looking for explanation of that. And one of the things that you're hearing is, well, maybe it's because you have this identity problem. Maybe it's you're really this thing or that, and you just didn't know it yet. And then you ask that question once on social media, you open up a sort of Pandora's box of all of this, affirming information. If you do a Google search, what you're going to get is an algorithm that drives you in the direction of more and more extreme information about a particular topic. So you've had experiences where you've ordered mashed potatoes for a Christmas gift.
Yes.
And then, the next 2 months you get nothing but ads for sour cream and chives and all those other kinds of things that are associated with that. But it always pulls you in that direction. And for younger people who are impressionable, it's really easy for them to get pulled in that direction by social forces, which are more concentrated in the social media environment.
Right, and those social media voices aren't people that know them. They're not people that care for them. They're voices. I mean, and if you are wondering what in the world is he talking about with mashed potatoes, it's a story for another day. But it is an entertaining one, and it's pretty fun. So we as parents, this can be a tough conversation to have with our kids, because our parents likely didn't have it with us, and we really haven't seen it done a whole lot. And so what are some practical tools for parents with this, whether it's a conversation or a way to be thinking about this issue that has grown? There are more young kids than ever who would put themselves in the LGBTQ community than any generation prior.
Yeah.
And so as parents with kids or nieces and nephews, or friends of our kids and nieces and nephews, or just kids around us who are going to put themselves in this category, what are practical tools for us to be thinking about in a healthy way, talking about in a healthy way?
Well, first of all, so what you said is true, that the incidence of these questions about gender or sexual orientation are dramatically higher, mainly because of the influence of what's referred to as Gen Z, so birth dates of 1997 and later. So historically, basically, as far as we can tell throughout history, the incidence of homosexuality was between 2 and 4%. The best estimates of transgender orientation worldwide are less than 1%, 0.1 to 0.6%. But if we look at recent estimates of Gen Z, it ranges from maybe 13 to up to 30%. And the implication of that is the expectation would be that if that was all biologically determined, that it wouldn't change. So that means there's a big social influence, at least as I see it, that's had that effect on driving up those percentages. So,
And what were the previous percentages again?
so 2 to 4% homosexual historically. I mean, in essentially every survey that was done. I mean, there's some variation because you don't know how honest people are and so on, but trusting the data, and less than 1% transgender, so 0.1 to 0.6.
Now, some could argue that, well, when it was seen as a negative thing in the social culture of the time, there's going to be way less people who are going to ascribe to it
Yes.
than now, where it's where you mentioned earlier, it's almost courageous and it's not seen as a negative thing. Is it possible that that those were just invalid percentages then, and now this is the current reality?
Possible, but not entirely likely. I mean, most of those things will run, those kinds of surveys are anonymous, so people don't have to worry about whether their responses are going to be published in an individual basis. They're published as part of group data. So there's always some variability when you ask those kinds of questions. But to say that we're going to have a change by a factor of 8 or so over the course of a single generation, not very likely.
Okay, so I'm a parent, and I've got young kids right now, but my kids, as they get older, they have friends who say that they are gay or they are trans. What are, like, as a parent, what's a practical tool for me how do I respond to my child or to my child's friend in that instance?
Well, a couple of potential circumstances there. One is that your child is the person whom their friend chooses to come out to, that no one else knows about their thoughts or their orientation or whatever. And so the number one thing to keep in mind there, in my estimation, is just that idea of, thank you for trusting me with this, and probably not too much more than that in that particular moment. And some, still, we're still friends. I still love you, whatever. And if the person presses the conversation, which is probably not likely in that moment, then you have those other discussions about, acceptance without agreement and all of those other kinds of things. But also the notion that acceptance goes two ways. I have a different perspective, and I'm asking you to accept my perspective in the same way you're asking me to accept yours, and to be able to have some open conversation about that. From the perspective of a parent, the biggest thing is if your child shares that information with you, the same thing is thank you for trusting me with that and reaffirming you can bring me anything. We can talk about anything, anytime, pal. And there's no limits on any of that. And in my mind, there are two guiding principles there. One is to listen a lot more than you talk, and to ask them what their perspective. Well, what does that mean to you when they tell you that? What do you think of? And how do you think that affects them and their life? And to try to help them have some empathy around that situation. And then how do you think I think about that? And find out what their perspective is on how they think you're going to react, so you have some ability to shape your own discussion around that.
Wow.
The second thing is don't answer questions that aren't being asked. again, we get in those moments where we're having the talk or whatever, and we sometimes feel compelled to unload all of this information, as I am right now. That's not necessarily directly relevant or is too scientific or whatever for the moment. Don't do that. Keep in mind what your kid's developmental level is, what they're capable of hearing and understanding, and just operate on feedback from them. And again, always stressing acceptance, but acceptance is not agreement. We don't have to agree with things people do to care about them and love them.
Yeah. So as a parent, that where this is really tough, tougher conversation, that because we've never maybe had it or we don't know how to have it. At times it could even feel almost hopeless. Is this a hopeless situation? Like if we have a child who identifies in this LGBTQ community, if it's something that we've never dealt with before, and maybe we've even grown up learning that it is a sin that condemns, like, are we now in this hopeless situation?
If this situation or any situation is hopeless, we're in the wrong building.
Yeah.
We live by hope, and so that's always going to be true. But it's not up to us to decide how that situation resolves or doesn't resolve. It's just up to us to be true to what our own beliefs and perspective are, to hang on to the truth, and to guide by what we believe, not by what we think other people are doing wrong. It's again, just it's never a good way to give directions by saying where not to go.
Yeah. So years ago, we had a pastor here at Kim King's named Dan Weber. I remember he gave a message on this topic, and through God's word, he established, okay, we do believe this to be a sin. And I remember he was talking about the scripture of, like, quit focusing on the speck in your neighbor's eye while you're waving around a plank and clotheslining people with your own. And then he referred to how Jesus took up each speck, each sliver, each plank, each log, and formed them into a cross on which he died to take care of them all. And so that was super helpful for me as a parent to think of it, to less categorize people in who may ascribe to this community as like a different type of sinner, but no, they're a sinner like me.
We're in the same club. I mean, yeah.
And Jesus came to die for all of us. So that's something that was really helpful for me. Dr. Tim Reilly, what else would you say to parents or people within the church community or even outside of it? Anything else you would say on this topic?
One of the things that occurred to me as we were talking is that this is, there are two different things that we're potentially addressing here. One is, what if your child comes to you and says, I am this, whatever this is, and that's maybe a separate discussion. The other is, they come to you and say, my friend said this, and we talked a little bit about how you respond to that. But that can be a difficult situation for parents who are concerned that, if I allow you to hang out with this person or to include this person, or that we say that, we accept them as a person, that somehow is going to rub off on you and influence you, and, that there's potential that you're going to turn in that direction or whatever. There's not much evidence to support that idea is possible, but I'm sensitive to how parents think about that, right? They're concerned about that. And so, that's a circumstance where I think they need to trust their own judgment. But I will tell you that in virtually every situation I've been in clinically where parents just said, no, you can't go into that environment. You can't hang out with that person. You can't, whatever. It's like every other thing you tell your kid that they can't do. You can't have a cookie. As soon as you turn their back, they're looking for the cookie jar, right? So the best posture is open, honest. We can talk about this. We can talk about anything. You're not going to tell me anything that's going to put me off or make me care any more or less about you or your friend, and go forward from there. So this is complicated stuff.
Right.
There's biology involved. There's social influences involved. There's political influences involved. And it seems as if at this point everything that we talk about has some political implication to it, and that complicates things. So to the extent that you can isolate kids from those outside influences and just say, let's just talk about the people involved and what does this mean? But again, also being honest that there are implications, and as much as the current society seems to want to celebrate some of these things, there are some potential very serious downsides to some of these things, particularly on the transsexual end of things, where you start talking about treatments that involve life-changing kinds of things for which we just don't have good, clear, long-term data to say this is a good idea. We don't know that. And I don't know how many of the decisions you made when you were 13 or 15 or 16 you would like to have shaping your entire life from that point forward. I'm not that smart now, but I was flat stupid when I was 16. All you got to do is go back and look through your yearbook and see what the quality of the decisions was like then. So.
Right. Yeah, I'm so grateful that I think I'm of the last generation that didn't have my teen years documented, which is going to work out for me in the future. I never plan on running for like a political spot, but it is a plus to not have every stupid decision that you ever made caught on video or on post.
The biggest thing, excuse me, but even though a lot of these things are celebrated in the media and at least superficially much more accepted, these are often really, really, really difficult circumstances for the people involved. And even though superficially they may embrace some of this celebration and pride things and all of that, there's often a struggle here in many ways. And that's the thing we need to be most sensitive to, in my estimation, is the human struggle of this. But as I mentioned earlier, get away from the idea of identifying people by some group. Mm-hmm. And saying, this is just another fellow traveler here with me, and how do we come to some accommodation? I interact with a number of people I disagree with on almost everything, but they're still my friends. They're still people I care about.
Yeah, we're still part of the bluegrass group together.
Yeah, we still get along, boy bands or not. No.
Yeah, I think it's important that we see people as created in the image of God. And if we see each person we come into contact with that way, we're not going to treat them as objects. And that includes your barista, because your coffee's taking too long, and now you put skim milk in. Right? You see how I'm shaped. I like my whole milk, and we get angry. But if I see that person in the image of God, I can more so realize, oh, just like me, I make mistakes. That was a mistake. Hey, could you switch this? I'd actually prefer whole milk. And they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, absolutely. But when we see people as objects, or we see people as identities, anything other than a child created by the Most High King, well, then that creates room in us to see them less than that. And so I do think it's important, whether we agree or disagree, that we love regardless. We love without hypocrisy, and we see them as a child created in the image of God.
Couldn't agree more. At the same time, don't minimize the truth, right? And we don't bend the truth or minimize the truth in the direction, because it means being more supportive.
Right.
We either believe the truth is the truth or we don't.
Right.
That's not a degrees of truth question. That's, things are true or they're not. And so now we're getting into these questions about biology and fluidity of biological sex, which is just not true.
Right.
But if we start to drift from those things for the sake of expediency, because it's just easier in that moment, then we set ourselves up for much bigger conflicts later on. Worse still, as I suggested earlier, from my perspective, we act to the detriment of that person, right? If we lie to the person for the sake of making a conversation more comfortable or convenient for us, I think we do them a disservice.
Yeah, we have a pretty great guidebook on top of Unstuck by Tim Reilly. Check it out on Amazon. A pretty great guidebook in God's Word, the Bible, that speaks to us about these things and tells us what the truth is, and points us to Christ. So, Tim, I love the practical tools of when a kid comes to us with any of these questions or information, to instead of jumping at it, to say, thank you so much for trusting me to share this with me, and then to lead with questions. Well, what do you think about it? What do you think I think about it? Because that's going to reveal a whole lot that might help us put us in a positive direction rather than a domineering.
Or may be very upsetting to you.
Well, we got to put our ego aside for our kids. So this has been another edition of a parenting podcast in the Beyond Sunday series. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We hope it was helpful. We understand that this isn't the entirety of this conversation, nor it is with any of these podcasts. So these conversations get to continue in your homes, with your families, with your friends, and as you do them, remember that each person you're with has been created in the image of God. The truth matters, and that we get to love regardless. So, Dr. Tim Reilly, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
All right. Have a great day.